Please don't go. Just stick around. We're going to have some fun here. Is the word data scaring you off? You really shouldn't. It's lots of fun. Well, well, well. Hey, the picture you see on the screen there on the right side was taken in Cotonou, Benin, last October. And it shows journalists teaming up during a data journalism program organized by CFE. Whichever country you're coming from, no matter how small or how big your organization is, there's something quite exciting about collaborative data journalism projects that you can't quite explain fully. Well, welcome to this session on the potential of data collaborations. My name is Marianne Bouchard. As said previously, I'm the manager of the Data Journalism Awards, and I'll be your moderator today. When you reach that moment when working on your own or within your own team is just not enough, when the project seems bigger than you, or when you find out that other audiences, other teams in other countries could also benefit from covering the issue you're tackling, when your work on a project that requires data and contacts in other regions to be exploited fully, that's when the potential of data collaborations kicks in. So when, how, where do you start? What are the differences between collaborating at a local level and collaborating at a national or international level? Does it change the way you work? What are the best tools and tips to facilitate collaborations? And what about funding? Those are some of the questions that we'd like to cover during this session with our three amazing speakers. First up, we have Cheryl Phillips, founder of the Big Local News Project and the Computational Journalism Lab at Stanford University. She will tell us how they share data for impact at a local level. Then we'll hear from Eva Constantaras, data journalist specialized in building data journalism teams in developing countries from across Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, you name it, on topics ranging from foreign aid and food insecurity to extractive industries and public health. She will talk about how you can collaborate to bring accountability using civic tech. And finally, we'll hear from Kwek Ser Quang Keng, digital journalist and trainer based in Malaysia. He is the competition officer of the Data Journalism Awards and founder of Data N. He will give us an insight on the challenges and lessons learned in collaborative data projects in Asia. And then we'll have a discussion with you, hopefully. So without further ado, let's start. Cheryl, the floor is yours.
All right, hi there. We're probably going to skip through my first slide really quickly because like all good journalists, I was editing things on deadline and I screwed up the logo placement. So, but it is a brand new logo and I'm really proud of it. The idea of Big Local News is that we're collaborating, and we're collaborating on a lot of levels. We're collaborating across disciplines, and by that I mean, so I work at Stanford, and I work with the engineering school and a lab called the Computational Policy Lab, so that when we're doing data analysis, if we're doing really complex or extra sophisticated analysis, I can bounce all of that analysis off of the engineering professors and the data scientists as part of that lab, and so can the journalists who are collaborating with us. We also partner across programs, a whole variety of programs, not just the engineering school, but I teach with other professors, and I work across programs across universities. So I work with the University of Maryland, for example, the University of Oregon. I had media law students putting in public records requests, which are then used by journalists. And we work across newsrooms. So one of the things that Big Local News does is that we try to collect data from a variety of local sources, but it is similar data. Then we normalize it so that we can aggregate up and tell broader stories, as well as work on the local stories. And I have classes that go after data that also work with newsrooms on their projects. So when I say collaborating across, I mean we're collaborating across kind of multiple levels. The last area of collaboration that we do is we work with the Stanford Library, and they archive every bit of data that we collect or that we bring in from newsrooms. So one of the things that happens in a local newsroom, and I've worked in a lot of local newsrooms, is you might work on your data project and you collect your data. It's arduous, it's hard, you had to put in a lot of public records requests perhaps, and it's messy. When you get it, you clean it up, you finally publish your project, you do all your reporting, and then you move on to the next project. And the data sits there, and then maybe you get a new computer, and then you can't find the data again, and it's just lost. And so you can't go back a year later or 2 years later or 10 years later, and you can't say, oh, well, you know what, this data would be really useful for that other newsroom across the state so they could compare. None of that happens. But we put it into an archive that lasts basically forever, and then we publish all of the data from that archive so anybody can access it, download it, and use it. We also can archive data that is sensitive and can be released upon request. The idea is that we're trying to build out an ecosystem to basically scale local news for a big impact. So some of the things that we do, just to kind of reiterate a little bit more, is we negotiate for data. We go city by city, county by county, state by state, and we put in public records requests for data that we think is useful for journalism projects. We do this in collaboration with the newsroom so that we know we're going after data that will be useful. We then normalize that data. Local newsrooms, especially in the United States, are stressed. They don't have a lot of extra time. They don't have, the cleaning of the data is like 90% of the work. And so we do that for them and kind of in conjunction with them. And then we do analysis again out of that data in the same way. We then archive the data and the methodologies so that we can do that same, you can follow that methodology and see exactly what happened. So we're very transparent. We share all of the data, and then we share story recipes, step by step. If you want to do this story out of this data, this is what you need to do. If you want to do a different story out of it, then we'll work with you to help you do the story, and then you can analyze that data, and we'll build out a story recipe for that story. So I'm telling you what we're doing so that you can think about like what you do, right? I mean, the idea is that for journalism to really succeed, for local journalism especially, to really succeed, we need to become collaborative. We need to move beyond this hyper-competitive silo system of doing journalism. If I do a story on one side of the United States for California, there's no reason we can't do a similar story in New Jersey or New York and help do that similar story. For a long time, conferences have been the place where journalists came to collaborate. And then they went back to their newsrooms and they became competitive again. I'm suggesting that we can be collaborative across the newsrooms, not just at conferences. The last thing that we do is we train journalists using our data. So a lot of journalists might not be versed in using data journalism skills or tools. And it's hard to get versed unless you have a project that you're working on. So we provide the local data for you, and then we walk you through how to analyze it, and then we follow up so that as you hit those inevitable roadblocks, we're there with our data scientists or with the data journalists from the Big Local team to provide support and help. And then you can publish. And hopefully the stories will have impact. Maybe they'll change laws or policies. It basically enables journalists to kind of have more scale. we go. So here's an example of what I mean. Forest fires are a huge problem in the U.S., especially in California and the West. There is a daily incident report. If there's a forest fire of 100 acres or more, the federal government files this report. And it's in a horrible data format. But it tells you how many tankers they used, if they used helicopters, how many of different types of firefighters they used, how much all of that costs, the perimeter of the fire. The data is in a format that changes every year, has no data dictionary, and it goes back 17 years. So it's just a pain. But we parsed through 3 years worth of that data, and then there was a huge fire called the Camp Fire in California in the fall that basically obliterated an entire town. And we ended up, my class used that 3 years worth of data to show why wildfire costs were escalating in California. We released the data, we released the story recipe, we published a story, and it ran in multiple newsrooms across the state. Now we're going back and getting we're doing the same thing with all 17 years of data, and we'll be providing that to newsrooms across the country this fire season so that they can do stories out of the data. None of those newsrooms have gone after this data or tried to clean it up because it's too hard, and they don't have time, but our staff has time. So we also build out story recipes. We work with a site called Workbench, which does data analysis without coding, and that's just another great resource. Here's just an example of some of the training that we've done on open policing data. Oh, and I skipped over one, and here's one of our groups of where you can see these are all journalists from local newsrooms who otherwise would not have gotten this training. They're all still working on stories now using the big local model. So,
thank you very much. Eva, you're next up. Can you pass on the clicker? Yeah. Sorry. Cheers.
Oh, I skipped one, sorry. Thought I was done. I think that's over.
Collaboration. That's it, right? Collaborating, yes?
Okay, so what I'm going to talk about... It's working, great. A little bit is how we can do data journalism with civic tech to increase accountability. Basically, my job is to set up data journalism teams in newsrooms where it's really not going well for the media. It's not going well for the media, it's not going well for the economy, it's not going well for the political environment. And telling journalists in these countries that we should be doing data journalism, it's a very hard sell. And this is true of local newsrooms across the world, I think. So why collaborate? How does collaboration help make data journalism more accessible? I just wrote a chapter for the State of Open Data book, co-authored with Alex Howard, in which we interviewed many, many data journalists across the world. And what we found is that journalists, they do think data is very important for watchdog reporting, but the cost and the complexity is really what is limiting people and what is stopping people from doing data journalism. And then finally, something that came up a lot was the sort of promise of automated journalism, that data journalism would automatically become faster as we made improvements in machine learning. It hasn't really happened, so we need to get a little bit more creative about how we can do data journalism with the resources that we have. I'm going to talk about two models to leverage collaboration to make data journalism more accessible. The first one is more what Cheryl talked about, and that's having kind of a centralized data team. So working with a network of local newsrooms that do the data analysis centrally, they do the heavy lifting for you, and then they push out accessible data with local angles to all the newsrooms that they work with in their network. So, ProPublica, Associated Press, OCCRP, lots of groups are starting to do that with their local networks. But what I'm going to focus on is a model that I found more effective, especially in developing country contexts. And that's partnering with different data collectors. So this might be think tanks, this might be civic tech groups, because there was this sort of impression that if we open data that somehow democracy would happen. And it turns out there's all these steps in between, like it's got to be somebody's job to work with this data. So I'm going to talk about how journalists have basically made data journalism feasible in their newsrooms by working together with civic tech groups that have great data but no users to make that information accessible. So I'm going to talk about 3 examples here. The first, I think we have our data editor in the room, Momi's here. I like this photo because this is Flor from La Nación with the director of Observatorio de Corrupción, and they basically met at a hackathon. So they had a hackathon about corruption and decided how can we work together to do more corruption stories. And what the civic tech group was collecting was information on the judicial system and what judges were getting assigned what cases. And again, that's data collection over years, monitoring sentencing, monitoring assignments. And then every once in a while, La Nación digs into this data and finds stories like this, where cases of bribery, which are supposed to be assigned through a raffle system, actually get assigned to friendlier judges more often than stricter judges. So again, the civic tech group is collecting the data, and La Nación is digging into it for regular beat coverage. Another example of this is the Nation Newsplex, which is the biggest data desk in Africa that I helped found a few years ago in the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a think tank. And again, they publish regular stories working together on things like public services, distribution of budgets, to produce data stories on government accountability. I'd like the website of because the Institute of Economic Affairs is really boring, but the Nation Newsplex does a really good job of really digging into why it matters to citizens. Then finally, India Spend. I think we also have someone from India Spend here. They have a long-term working relationship with the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, going back years to do a better job of covering environmental issues in India. And what I like about this example is their relationship gets deeper and deeper. So while on a practical standpoint, it's simply cheaper and more sustainable to work with a civic tech group, it also, as the relationship advances, they also co-designed research. So if the journalist knows that their audience wants a specific type of story, they can work with the civic tech group to co-design research and data collection around that issue. And then over time, it really builds up the data literacy of both the news organization and the public that's covering that beat. And again, I wanted at the very end to emphasize the importance of the beat coverage around data journalism. The more you build up the audience's data literacy around a specific beat with data collected by a civic tech organization, the better the public understands that issue in context.
Nice. Thank you very much for that. Last but not least, Kang.
Right, thank you, Marianne. So because I live and I grow up in Asia, however, I don't like to say that I want to talk about Asia because Asia is huge. So I always put the words parts of Asia in my presentation. So I'm going to look at some of the more cultural, more local challenges and lessons that I notice when I do data journalism trainings and workshops in Asia. This is what I do. I do data journalism workshops and trainings for newsrooms, and I also try to forge collaboration between newsrooms. So the first thing is not everyone likes to share. Sometimes we take for granted that people think that sharing has extra value, but usually that is not the case. Sharing of free copies that you can publish is fine. but sharing the reporting burden. Not just that, but getting feedbacks, getting input from your reporting partners, from another country, which means a lot of discussions with a lot of meetings. People sometimes don't appreciate that. So in order to overcome this mindset problem, you actually have to talk a lot and make sure that you have very clear incentives and goals in your projects. So the example that I would like to show you is this year, the Indonesian elections. So what happened is that if you look at Indonesian elections, it is huge. It has 190 million voters with 800,000 polling stations, with 245,000 candidates. And you can see that they have to use all sort of methods to carry their ballots. They use the makeshift boats, because there was a huge flood. And in some rural areas, they have to use elephants to carry all the ballot boxes to rural areas. And after the voting is done, you have to wait for 1 month for the official result to come out. So how do you solve that? So what happened is that newsrooms and some of the think tank, some of the NGOs, so they come together. They pick about 5,000 or 8,000 polling stations. So they send their reporters, they send their staff to monitor the vote counting in those polling stations. They come back, they share the data, and even that is not the complete data. They share the data and they try to estimate and extrapolate to get the national estimates. So that's why you get the result saying that Jokowi has won just maybe a few days, after the polling day. But the official result you have to wait for after 1 month. So this is a project that has very clear incentives. Everyone knows that if we join this project, we all get the data, we all get our news out really quick. And the other challenge is that citizen expectations is very different in many different countries. For example, so this affects the impacts of your project or your investigation, In many countries, the citizens are just like, okay, are these issues even important to us? We don't care, just like this guy. So one typical case is that the Panama Papers. This map shows you the countries where investigations happen, triggered by the Panama Papers. You can see that the impact in Asia is much less compared to in other parts, compared to in Europe and the West. That's because tax evasion is not an issue that gets a lot of attention in Asia. First reason is that most of the people, we don't pay tax because the income is too low. The second thing is if for small businesses, everyone is evading tax. And that's true. Everyone is, and so that is something normal, right? And because the corruption is rampant, because the enforcement, the policy is not that good, so it's very, very easy for people to not pay their tax. So when you're talking about tax evasion in Asia, unless you have very clear and strong evidence, or else people just don't care, when you publish things. So when going to when you're picking issues, you have to make sure that those issues really have the kind of public interest in the country that you want to collaborate with. The other one is our newsrooms capacity and state censorship. We have very few newsrooms that have data capacity, but we have many countries that have very strong censorship from the state. So in this case, a lot of time when, let's say you want to work with journalists in China, and you know that this is a country where a lot of issues they can't touch at all. And this happens not just in China, but in many other countries. And it's not that these journalists don't want to report. They are good journalists, they are independent journalists, but they have to, in order to survive in that country, they will have to know when to push the limits and when to toe the line. So when you're asking them to say, hey, let's do a collaboration on, exposing corrupted officials, they might tell you that, oh, this is not really our interest. And the real reason is that we can't do that at all. So in this case, looking at the capacity issues as well as state censorship issue, one solution is actually to look at smaller more simpler projects that deal with less politically sensitive issues. So for example, recently, a group of Asian-based journalists, they just launched these projects called the Pangolin Reports. They are still looking for publishing and reporting partners. They have journalists from Asia, as well as Europe, as well as the US to work on this project. It is about the smuggling, the poaching, and also the illegal trade of pangolin, right? It's actually a very cute animal, if you look at it. Right. So these are some of the lessons, some of the things that we should bear in mind when we go to Asia and try to do some collaboration projects. And the last thing I don't have to repeat here, Cheryl has mentioned, is that not just data sharing, your reporting recipe is a very good collaboration as well. So this story is about bogus journals and bogus scientific conferences. What happened is that it was a collaboration between a few newsrooms under the ICIJ last year, and then a Taiwan media, which is the Commonwealth magazine, 天下杂志. When they saw the stories, they reached out to NDR, which is a German broadcast which was involved in that project. And NDR was happy to share with them all the reporting recipes and data as well. And Commonwealth magazine managed to do a story on the Taiwanese scientists and researchers early this year. And they just published it like in March. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Thanks, guys. Can I get the clicker? Or you can just pass to the next one. Right. I would like to take the time. We might not have the time to cover all of those topics that we see on screen now, but I suggest that we pick one or two and try to stay until they kick us out, right? Is that a good plan? What about, we just talked about, even you all shared tips on how to best go about collaborations, and maybe we could elaborate a little on that. What each of you think is the best tips you could give somebody who wants to do a collaborative project, whether it's at a local level or an international level, whether you're in Asia or in some other parts of the world?
Personally, I think you need to look for things that are extensible. So if it's a topic that you can see being replicated in multiple communities, then it's one that might be have high potential for collaboration, because you know that there'll be a motivation from all the various news organizations that might be similar. So that's one thing that, can you replicate that same project in multiple places, because then it's easier to go find partners.
Eva, would you have some practical workflow tips to share with us on things to really set up from the start to get it right?
I think one mistake journalists often make is they're the first ones to ever think of this idea for a data story. So I think doing research about how data journalists have reported it in other areas in other countries, then stake out your territory. And usually with collaborations, I say the first thing you need is a hypothesis. And all the collaborators need to agree on the hypothesis together, because without that, just because you think you're vaguely talking about the same topic, whether it's police misconduct or violence against women, those are really big topics, right? So before you collaborate, choose a specific hypothesis before you divide up the work. And I think that ensures you have a strong story at the end, and that there isn't any unnecessary work or partners that feel like they've done work that wasn't used for the story.
Cool. King, do you have anything to share with us?
I actually don't have, I just think about in Asia, when we want to do collaborations, is cross-border projects. It's actually very hard to find partners sometimes, because we don't have so many conferences where journalists from different countries can get to know each other. So sometimes I got a lot of requests like, hey, King, do you know anyone in Thailand that I can work with? Do you know anyone in Philippines that I can work with? I always get that kind of requests. So I'm actually thinking of setting up a network of data journalists. And then the next challenge is that we don't really have that many data journalists in the region. So
But
In
you
that-
have many journalists that end up doing data journalism.
Yeah.
Not
So we don't
always
ha-
knowing
yeah,
it.
Yeah, like many journalists that do investigations. So yeah, that might be a very good starting point, to have more connect communication and to maybe to build a network of journalists.
And so you all touched on both the local and the international level of collaborations. What would you say is the difference between working on a local collaborative data project and working on an international collaborative project? Are there similarities or very big differences?
Well, I actually think they could be one and the same. So you can, that's one of the things we're doing with Big Local. And one thing I didn't mention maybe explicitly before is we're building a platform so people can upload their data, and there'll be tools that they can access, and they'll have projects that they can then share with other organizations. You may do a very local story for your site, but then because everybody else is doing their local stories, there's this web, and then you could scale up and tell an international or a national story or a regional story out of that. And that's where you get more into the traditional collaboration that Ava was talking about, I think.
Yeah, I think internationally media, especially international media houses, are wasting a huge opportunity to utilize the network of data journalists that exist globally. I think topics like income inequality, reproductive health, food security, these are cross-cutting data topics that should be reported in the global context so that we can see with the rise of polarization and ethno-nationalism, if we had more of a cross-cutting international focus that brought in data journalists from all these different countries to show the similarities and how a lot of the mechanisms to reduce freedoms work very similarly from country to country. Again, it would reduce the costs of doing data journalism, and it would provide much richer international reporting on a lot of these global issues that we're facing.
And then you'd have the really local stories out of it as well as those bigger, broader stories, right? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I'm told that this is a wrap, guys. So we're gonna, unfortunately, won't be able to do Q&As, but you stick around and you can always come to us and have a chat later on. Which leads me to tonight is the Data Journalism Awards ceremony happening. So you can always catch us there, have a chat, and some good food. I hope you've registered. And you see on screen that it's still time to vote for the Public Choice Award. So go for it, guys. Thank you very much to our panelists. It was a great discussion. I hope you enjoyed it. And this is it for us. Thank you.
Marianne, Clemens, thank you so much. And sorry, we need to whisk you guys away to the Data Journalism Awards, and we have our very last session, and we want to make